Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco socialist program that I ran on with Angela Walker, my vice presidential running mate in 2020. So, no guests today. Let's talk about the last 10 days from hell in America. I'm sure most of you saw that debate or clips of it. It was a debate between a frail near corpse and a lying criminal maniac. That's what the leadership of this country has offered us. And I'm really angry again at the Democrats, particularly the progressive Democrats, who endorsed Biden early, despite obvious questions about his physical and mental fitness, not to mention his policies. And they did this despite his terrible position on the genocidal war in Gaza, climate action, immigration policy across the board. No policy demands. So, and then they shut down the primaries. So anybody wanted to challenge Biden couldn't get a debate with him. So here we are. And while there's much talk now among Democratic Party elites and funders and media saying Biden should step aside, Biden's camp is circling the wagons, particularly his family, who I think he takes most of his counsel from. But you also have to realize there's a whole coterie of longtime aides and younger aides whose careers depend on Biden remaining the candidate and hopefully the president. So he is not hearing from his circle what's going on. In that interview last night with George Stephanopoulos, Biden was denying reality of the polls. And I think that was a line. I don't think they can hide from him the reality of what the polls show. But, at this point, he lost a few points after that debate. The camps are pretty hardened, so you wouldn't expect him to lose a lot. But he's on average 6% behind now compared to being 10% ahead in 2020 when he narrowly won. If 20,000 plus some odd votes had flipped in Arizona and Michigan, Arizona and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Trump would have won the Electoral College, even though he lost the popular vote by 9 million votes. The Democrats are asleep at the wheel. Why haven't they taken on the Electoral College? The only time a Republican was first elected in the 21st century was when they lost the popular vote and won the electoral vote. I'm talking about George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And the Democrats are inert. No, that's not an issue for them. And I have to admit that, it's come up on this podcast and people have said, Biden's getting dementia, he can't handle it. And I, said, I kind of brushed that aside and said, let's focus on his policies and criticizing that, knowing that there's a whole, army of, people in his administration who can execute the policies. But that debate shocked me. I mean, he's declined a whole lot. And I'm angry that, Biden's camp has kept it hidden from us. And, looking back as I think about it now, I learned that he's done fewer interviews than any president in modern history. There was the debate in 2019 when Joaquin Castro pointed out in one of Biden's response that he seemed to have forgotten at the end of his 2 minutes what he said at the beginning and contradicted himself. And Joaquin Castro was, vilified for that by the Democratic establishment. And he's kind of out of sorts with the Democratic power structure. And you have to think, Biden lucked out in 2020. With the COVID lockdown, he wasn't as exposed. And his debate performances weren't good, but they certainly weren't as terrible as they were last week. And so, the Democrats are debating this, but I think it's political malpractice if they stick with Biden, because Biden in his current condition, I don't think can win the election. He could, because so many people hate Trump. I mean, Trump was, nothing to brag about in that debate either. I mean, he was a fire hose of lies. But Biden couldn't handle it. I mean, the thing to do with that is pick out the most obvious one and nail Trump on it. And Biden was jumping all over the place and forgetting his train of thought and, ends up at the end of one uh, of his responses by saying, "We beat Medicare," whatever the hell that means. So, man, oh man, I mean, how are we in this situation? We're stuck with the two major parties offering the physically and mentally declining Genocide Joe, or another Democrat who will not force Israel to end the genocide, and Trump, a sociopathic criminal and inveterate liar who will be worse than even Biden and the Democrats across the board. Biden, in the case of Trump, he will openly support Israeli oppression and slaughter of Palestinians. He'll sell the Ukrainians to Putin's Russia. And at home, he plans to deport over 10 million undocumented immigrants, splitting up families where there are a mix between documented and undocumented immigrants. He said he's going to persecute his political opponents and any public dissenters, from generals, other Republicans like Lynn Cheney or Mike Pence, using military tribunals in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And of course, he'll accelerate the climate catastrophe. Although the fact that Biden has approved 50% more oil and gas drilling permits on federal lands, makes you wonder how Trump could do worse, but he'll try. So this is not a choice we can accept. Our vote is our voice. It's our way of expressing our support for the policies we want. I think the best option we've got is Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. She's a vote for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, more progressive taxation, reordering our priorities from militarism to human environment and environmental protections. And I say that, I'm appalled by her position on Ukraine. The Green Party candidate should be a consistent anti-war, anti-imperialist that opposes Russia's war crimes against Ukrainians as much as they oppose Israel's war crimes against Palestinians. But she's as hypocritical as Biden. They just take a different position on each of these imperialist wars. And that's embarrassing, I think, for the Green Party and our movement. And it's unfortunate that, between Cornel West and Claudia de la Cruz and Jill Stein, there is no internationalist who supports Ukrainian national liberation as well as Palestinian national liberation, not to mention many other struggles around the world. But on balance, you do a balance sheet, I think Stein is the best alternative we've got. She'll be on the ballot a lot more than West and de la Cruz. I mean, the Party for Socialism and Liberation is hardcore campist. In other words, they're in the camp of everybody that opposes the U.S., no matter how oppressive, exploitative, and indeed imperialist they are. And, Cornel West has the same position on most issues as Jill Stein, including Ukraine. So that's unfortunate, but that's where we are. So that was, that started this 10 days of hell. The next thing was actually the Chevron decision, but I want to talk about the immunity decision that came down on Monday first. So the Supremes gave Trump presumptive immunity for his actions when he tried to overturn the 2020 election. And they said the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for anything he does as an official act as president. And they're going to debate what's an official act. It said he has presumptive immunity even for acts he did as a private citizen. So that requires the DOJ to go before a court and explain, the act that they're trying to prosecute was not official, it was private. And that's going to be tough. That further delays the prosecution of Donald Trump for his attempt to overturn the 2020 election, for stealing classified documents, for interfering in the election in Georgia, and even the 34 convictions he has for committing election law violations and business records fraud. So he's not going to be tried before the election. And of course, if he wins, he's going to get the DOJ to drop the federal prosecutions, and he's going to put as much pressure as he can on the states of Georgia and New York to drop those state prosecutions and, in New York's case, convictions. Even if Trump loses, he's going to be able to delay the cases for many months or years by arguing that each alleged crime was an official act. And he's got the backing of the Supreme Court decision for that. So that's going to take many months or years. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, I'll quote a couple things she said. The immunity decision, quote, creates a law-free zone around the president. He's above the law. It, quote, gave Trump all the immunity he asked for and more. And that's why the court did it. They're a bunch of political hacks. The decision makes the president, quote, a king above the law. And we just had the anniversary of our 248th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence from an English king who was a tyrant. And now we've reestablished the king as our president. So the president has dictatorial policies. And Biden, should not be so self-righteous in condemning this decision because he's already argued for immunity from prosecution. When Biden was sued in U.S. District Court for complicity in genocide in Gaza and violating laws prohibiting genocide, his legal team argued in court that there were no constraints on the president's foreign policy decisions. So now he can use the immunity decision in his defense in that case. In other words, the president's foreign policy powers make him immune against genocide. I spoke with a group of Ukrainian socialists in Kyiv July 4th. Ironically, the 4th of July, the anniversary of our revolution. And they asked me why Biden and the Democrats were so muted in their protest of the Supreme's immunity decision. Why did Biden just make a brief 3-minute statement? Why aren't the Democrats mobilizing mass protests like the Greens and Social Democrats mobilized millions to protest the rise of the new neo-fascist Alternative for Deutschland over the winter? And, I had to tell them the leadership of the Democratic Party is authoritarian too. They insulated Biden from primaries, and all the progressives lined up behind him. And of course, the Democratic leaders don't believe in mass mobilizations. I don't think they know how to do them. And when they happen, like the George Floyd protests, the first thing they want to do is steer people off the streets and into Democratic election campaigns where they're able to take the protest movement's demands for granted. And we've seen that, the response to George Floyd has been more federal funding for police departments from Biden. So people mobilized to elect Biden to stop Trump, but it hasn't stopped Trumpism. Joe Biden, has continued, I've said this many times, his bipartisanship with the Republicans who tried to overthrow his election. He's normalizing them, not fighting them. So we can't rely on the Democrats to defend our democratic rights. We know that as Greens because the Democrats, while they talk about voting rights, although they couldn't get that legislation passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration when they had majorities in both houses, because they would take on the filibuster in the Senate. But party suppression is also a form of voter suppression. Voting rights should include not just the right to a ballot, but the right to vote for the candidate you want with that ballot. And the Democrats are blocking that as best they can. The Democrats are authoritarian. Of course, Trump is worse, no doubt about that. But the Democrats are bad. And that's why, we need the Green Party to get its act together and mount a real opposition to the two-party system of corporate rule. And at the end here, I'm going to have some good news about what the Greens did in England and Wales over on July 4th. But let's look at the Chevron decision, which is almost as significant as the immunity decision. The Supreme Court overturned the Chevron doctrine, which for 40 years, including case law that followed the decision, instructed courts to defer to federal agencies' reasonable interpretations of laws passed by Congress to implement what they wanted those laws to do. Everything from clean water, clean air, food safety, labor rights, climate protection, freedom from fraud by financial institutions, and many other things. But the court's ruling, and they consolidated two cases, and ended the 40-year precedent. It was established by the case of Chevron versus Natural Resource Defense Council in 1984. And the Chevron doctrine held that the judges should defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation of the law using scientific evidence if the congressional legislation didn't give specific instructions on the question that came up in the course of regulation. And now the judges themselves will determine regulations. And the Supreme showed how damn ignorant they are in that decision. In their majority decision, these idiotic reactionaries confused nitrous oxide with nitrogen oxides, and then insisted that they, not the EPA, should provide the final word on regulating air pollution and every other regulation. Of course, nitrous oxide is laughing gas that you may have had going to the doctor or the dentist. It's for sedation and pain relief. And nitrogen oxide is an ozone precursor, in other words, an air pollutant, and a greenhouse gas that heats the planet. Now, nitrous oxide, the laughing gas, also is an ozone precursor and greenhouse gas, but it is produced in tiny amounts compared to nitrogen oxides, which are created whenever fossil fuels are combusted. And this is not even high school chemistry. This is common knowledge, except for these geniuses on the Supreme Court. And for Justice Neil Gorsuch, who wrote these decisions, and all the other conservative justices that signed off on it, and all their law clerks and other staff that let this ignorant statement go through in the final written decision, shows exactly why the courts are not qualified to substitute for experts in the agencies in writing regulatory rules. Now, there was some press coverage of this, and the Supreme Court went back and amended the decision to say nitrogen oxide instead of nitrous oxide, but they'd already exposed their ignorance. And the damned arrogance of these right-wing justices to think that they can acquire the specialized knowledge in every case to deal with complex scientific issues, and especially thinking that our federal courts have been packed with Bush and Trump appointees who are, a lot of them, Christian fundamentalists who get their cues from literal reading of the Bible rather than scientific findings. I mean, we're in big trouble here. And the Supremes who say they're just calling balls and strikes, no, they're legislating, not adjudicating here. And they arrogated to themselves the power to overturn a previous decision, a precedent that has been solidified in case law in over 18,000 court decisions based on the Chevron doctrine. And so, these justices are Republican political hacks who have no principle. They just make their rulings to benefit their ideological dogmas, not to mention their corporate benefactors. And we've had a lot of news about how corrupt, Thomas and Alito and those others are, where they're getting gifts from these very wealthy people. Now, the Chevron doctrine, when it was adopted in 1984, it was in the Reagan era, and the right-wing justices then, it was a narrow majority, assumed that Republicans would control the White House and therefore regulation writing in the agencies for at least a couple decades. They thought Reagan would get a second term, and then George H.W. Bush would have another 2 terms, and it would go on. Antonin Scalia, the original, far-right justice, praised the Chevron doctrine. And then today they did an about-face because the Republicans know that they have a hard time getting their people elected to president and controlling the agencies. So now the Supremes are counting on the right-wing judges that control the courts for the next 2 or 3 decades, because they don't see the prospects of electing presidents being in their favor. So there are no principles involved here for these right-wing justices. It's only opportunistic politics. And whatever it takes to destroy what they call the administrative state, in other words, regulations. They'll do. It's appalling. So, we can respond to this. One thing is to, keep going to public hearings and encouraging the agencies to issue regulatory rules based on scientific evidence according to the intent of congressional legislation that established those agencies. And the other thing is to pass legislation to codify the Chevron doctrine. Progressive Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal, as soon as this decision came down, urged Congress to pass the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which she introduced about a year ago, which is designed to, prevent what happened in the courts. And Senator Edward Markey also announced he was going to introduce legislation more directly aimed at what this decision did. And I don't know which bill is better or if we need to support both. But what I do know is that Congress must act before the corporations run roughshod over all federal worker, consumer, and environmental protections. So it's been a rough 10 days, but on July 4th, we got some good news. Well, actually the next day. The Green Party of England and Wales elected 4 members of parliament. They'd only had one before. It was Carolyn Lucas, who had been in there since 2010, and she was stepping down. But the person who ran in her district won handily, and they won in 3 other districts. And their percentage of the national vote went from 3% to 7%. And the Greens were growing before, really fast in the mid 2010s before Jeremy Corbyn was able to mobilize the labor left behind his bid for Labour Party leadership in 2015. And a lot of people that were going in the Greens then went into the Corbyn movement. But he was dumped after a bad showing for Labour in 2019. And the centrist, really center-right, Keir Starmer took his place. And Labour's landslide victory this Thursday crushed the Conservatives and gives the Labour a substantial majority in Parliament, gives them the power and responsibility. I think it's a good position for the Greens to be in because just like we do better when the Democrats are in power because they inevitably disappoint progressives and then they turn to the Greens, I expect the Greens will continue to grow with Labor in power. Now, one lesson from this election, as if we didn't need to take it up because we have the same problem, is it showed how disproportionate winner-take-all district elections are. They call them first-past-the-post elections in the UK. Labour only won 33% of the vote, but they got 64% of the seats. That's double the seats they would have got under a proportional representation system. And Labour only increased their share of the vote by 1.5% compared to 2019. And in fact, Starmer who replaced Corbyn, who was kind of drummed out and expelled from the Labour Party, he got 3 million votes less than Corbyn got in 2017 and 500,000 votes less than Corbyn got in 2019, and when Labour lost badly to the Conservatives. So Labour's vote was down from those elections. Its share of the vote was only up 1.5%. So what you really have here is a collapse of the Conservatives, not a mandate for Labour. And just to show the disproportionality, the Greens won 7% of the vote, up from 3% in 2019, and they got less than 0.6% of the seats. That's less than 10% of the seats they would have got under a proportional representation system. By their vote, if it was proportional, they should have about 40 members of parliament, not just 4. Now, the Greens are one of the parties that are campaigning for proportional representation, and hopefully the disproportionate results of this election will give that campaign momentum. They already have proportional representation in local elections in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, the London Assembly, and of course, right next door in Ireland, they use it in all elections. And we're making progress here in the US, as I pointed out many times. So this is a reform we're winning. And if we can continue to expand it in the American politics, it will change our politics radically because the Greens will get their fair and proportional share of representation in government. So that's one lesson. We got to keep pushing on ranked choice voting, particularly proportional ranked choice voting, to get proportional representation in legislative bodies. And then the other lesson is that even if we don't have proportional representation in the House, and there's legislation for that, but it doesn't have a lot of support even from the progressives. That's something we've got to push. Another lesson is that the Greens in England and Wales were able to elect 4 members of parliament despite the first past the post system. And what they did is they had a foundation of 800 elected local councillors in 170 local councils across England and Wales. And those are partisan elections. A lot of the Greens that are elected are in nonpartisan elections in this country. So what that gave them was a bench of office holders and campaigners with experience, and they were able to run 574 candidates in the 640 constituencies. And if you look at the results, they were consistent. Most of those Greens were getting about the average that the Greens got. They'd come in third or fourth or fifth, but they were getting, around 7%. So they were running credible campaigns. The other thing the Greens did at the national level was they decided, based on polling, to concentrate their national resources on 4 districts. And those are the 4 districts they won. So I think, those are lessons for us. And I would just add that the Australian Greens have used a similar bottom-up approach to win seats in Australia's House of Representatives. They built a base of local elected officials and then concentrated their resources on a few winnable districts. Now, it's a little easier in Australia because they have ranked choice voting. It's single-member instant runoff voting for single-member districts, which means, unlike the Senate in Australia, if you don't get the majority at the end of the ranked choice distribution, you're not elected. But still, the fact that they did that same bottom-up approach, build a bench of people that are good candidates and good campaigners, and got representation in the House as well as the proportional Senate in Australia, is something that we should learn from. And it's something I believe we can replicate. It's just a matter of, bearing down in our local areas and, building real local organizations, running credible candidates, winning local offices, and building up from there. And to the extent we can get ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting, it's going to make it easier for us. But without building that base, it's not going to happen. So, it's got to be grassroots organizing and building from the bottom up. So I'm glad I could conclude with a little good news, but in America, it's been a tough 10 days to bear. So let's see what you have to say, what questions you have. Andrew Hager, Howie, where do you stand on repealing the Apportionment Act and the Electoral College? Do you believe that this will help third parties increase their chances of winning elections years from now? The Apportionment Act, maybe you can say in the chat exactly what you're talking about. I'm assuming you're talking about the law that passed in 1965 requiring single-member districts for electing people to the House. And there is a bill called the Fair Representation Act that is in Congress. It's in committee. It's not moving right now, but it would replace that with multi-member districts and proportional ranked choice voting among those, in those multi-seat districts to get proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And the Electoral College, repeal the damn thing. It's a, 18th century anachronism. And as I pointed out at the top, it has caused twice in this century, and the only times Republicans were first elected, allowed them to take power after losing the popular vote. And I think most Americans get that. And, there should be a campaign to repeal it. The Democrats aren't doing it. That's why we need the Green Party. So, if we see, I'm looking to see if I got it right on the Apportionment Act. Well, okay, so that's my answer. Yeah. Repeal the single member district for the House and the Electoral College. Amy L. Sachs. The free and equal debate, which includes Stein, will be happening July 12th. Finally, a debate worth paying attention to. Yeah, it's good that Stein is going to this one. She didn't go to one of these in 2016, and for the understandable reason that she should have been in the major party debates, and here she is debating very marginal candidates, except for Robert Kennedy if he shows up, who's got millions and millions in a name. But yeah, that'll be interesting, and I'll tune in and we'll see what they have to say. But the fact that the only national debates that the major media are going to broadcast are Trump Biden debates, which are painful to watch. Oh man, it's infuriating to think that that's what the ruling parties in this country offer when we offer much better candidates as Greens. It's just infuriating. Nameless name. Howie, what do you think of the Libertarian Party? Well, I think good and bad things about them. Good is they're persistent, they're energetic, they have good positions generally on foreign policy, on drug policy reform, on cutting back on corporate welfare, but they have had bad positions on economics, economic justice. So it's a mixed bag. I have worked with them on ballot access and drug policy reform and debated them on those economic questions. So it's a mixed bag. I don't think, if we had a ranked choice vote, they'd probably come up for me before the Democrats and Republicans. Not, just because I think they have some good policies, and I like the fact that they're trying to build a multi-party democracy like the Greens are. The other problem I have is that they have a right-wing faction that now seems to be in control of the National Committee. Certainly the co-chairs, the chair, the Mises caucus, which has said a lot of hurtful things toward people of color, immigrants, and it's always been there in the Libertarian Party, but they seem to have gotten the upper hand to the point where it's created splits in places like Pennsylvania, where they formed a new party with the Libertarian platform, but without the racism. And when I was down there petitioning a couple years ago for the Pennsylvania Green candidates for statewide office, I ran into these people. So the Libertarian Party has a lot of internal problems. In fact, I noticed that the Colorado Party is going to put Kennedy on their ballot, not the nationally nominated candidate, which is probably in violation of their affiliation with the National Libertarian Party. So we'll see how that goes. But they have divisions, and it's interesting that, in 2016 and 2020, the Libertarians polled ahead of the Republicans. Now they're polling, it's close, behind Jill Stein and even Cornel West, who get 1 or 2%, and the Libertarians barely get 1%. So that's interesting to watch. And, I'm disappointed that these racists have got such a prominent position in the Libertarian Party. Beatty Dimmitt, what if a Democrat offered to boost our campaigns in deep red states in return for our support in the swing states? Democrats in South Dakota, Texas, Tennessee, Indiana, etc., are not going to win electoral votes there. And that makes voting Democrat there a waste of votes. On the other hand, if Democrats vote green in large numbers in the red states, it could put us over the top for becoming a minor party by FEC labels. And that, yeah, if you get over 5%, you become a minor party by FEC labels, and it also entitles you to a large public election or public campaign grant for the general election in 2028, which would be worth at least $20 million. Well, first of all, this is not going to happen. The Democrats, even if the Greens wanted to do it, would not do it. And I don't think the Greens should do it. We need to have an independent identity, alternative program, and not get into playing games with the Democrats, who we're really in opposition to. And if we start playing those games, our identity as an opposition and a real alternative to the two corporate party system will get watered down and confused. I just think it's a bad approach. You know, we should run, ask people for their votes, tell them we're working on ranked choice voting to get rid of the spoiler effect. We're working on proportional representation to get rid of gerrymandering, which makes the disproportionality of winner-take-all elections even worse. You know, talk to people about those things, but you know, not try to, you know, do this kind of vote trading thing with the Democrats, who I wouldn't trust a second, to follow through on their end of a bargain if it was made. But I don't think the Greens should make that bargain. Julian Villareal. Howie, can you talk about the right-wing Project 2025 and why Democrats are fear-mongering about it instead of trying to stop the far right? Well, you know, the Democrats' fear is the best argument they've got because there's not a lot positive they can campaign on in terms of accomplishments. I mean, the economy is okay, but people aren't feeling it. The climate action is weak. The immigration policy is, you know, accommodating the Republicans', you know, mean-spirited, racist policies. Not to mention, you know, ending the right to asylum, which should be a, you know, something that is in the American tradition of upholding democracy and human rights. And as I was talking earlier, you know, instead of fighting the far right by exposing their lies, by ridiculing their ridiculous policies, and by, you know, giving them no quarter and saying, you know, we don't need bipartisanship. We need to defeat them really badly. And here's why. And you can talk about everything from abortion. You could, the climate action, which the Democrats don't have a lot to brag about, but it's better than what the Republicans offer. So, and we have to recognize Project 2025, that's a Heritage Foundation, 900-page, you know, basically user's manual for the next Trump administration, where it outlines how they're going to establish, you know, authoritarian dictatorial rule by the president. They're going to purge the civil service, which has been protected since, you know, the late 1800s from political, you know, appointees, and lots of opportunities for, you know, embezzlement, fraud, and favors. They're going to fire 50,000 of those people and put their own lackeys in place. You know, you go right across the board, you know, eliminating Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid.
Hey everybody, Howie seems to have lost his internet connection, so hopefully he'll be back. I thought it was me at first, so I left and came back. But so yeah, hopefully he'll be back in a second. Um, Try to text it. Sorry about that. Oh, here he comes. You back?
I'm back. I'm on the hotspot.
Cool.
Okay, I don't know where I cut out. The power went out and then the internet's still out. So I'm on my phone's hotspot. Hopefully that will work for the next 18 minutes. So I'm not sure where I was cut off, but I was basically saying what is so dangerous about this 900-page manual called Project 2025 that the Heritage Foundation has written up for the incoming Trump administration. And I guess I'll just add that the head of the Heritage Foundation said, I think it was this week, that the transition to Trump will go smoothly unless the left, by which he means the Democrats, as well as the real left, it'll be nonviolent unless we disrupt it, which is basically saying, don't resist or we'll get violent against you. So, yeah, we're in a dangerous position. And if you want to, I'd read Project 2025 stuff, not near bedtime, because you won't be able to sleep. It's pretty scary what they're proposing. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, I'm thinking of distancing myself from the Greens due to their view on the Russo-Ukrainian, their view of forcing negotiations, despite how Putin never keeps his word. What should I do? I would say stay and fight. I think the Greens, at least by the vote in the National Committee 18 months ago, was pretty much split down the middle. And I think you go to the rank and file Greens who are not on the National Committee. They're pretty much like the broad center left in this country and the broad peace movement who oppose, Russia's invasion, feel solidarity with the Ukrainians. And so we need to stay and make our arguments. The Greens have a base of, state parties and experience in a lot of localities. You just can't replace that. I mean, where are you going to go? So I would say, Cornel West is saying he's starting a Justice for All party, but that's not going to happen. He was never part of an organization. He's never been an organizer. That's just a convenience to get on the ballot, and he's not doing well at that. So the Greens are the, independent left political party, and we've got to fight for a good position, an internationalist position that's in solidarity with everybody fighting against occupation and oppression, not be selective anti-imperialists who want to apologize for authoritarian states like Russia. So what you should do is stay and fight. Via email, thoughts on the French elections. Well, they're tomorrow. It's very interesting. I think a lesson for us is how when Macron called the snap elections, the left got together and they made compromises. I mean, there were pro-Putin, or at least not really in solidarity with Ukraine, factions of the left, the communists, and Mélenchon's France Unbowed. While on paper they were for military aid to Ukraine, in practice they were not helpful in the French parliament. But they came together and they hammered out a program, including supporting military aid to Ukraine, seizing the assets of Russian oligarchs, war crimes tribunals for the Russian war criminals. Pretty strong statement on Ukraine, as well as a progressive economic program across the board. So the coalition includes the Greens, the Socialists, the Communists, France Unbowed, the Anti-Capitalist Party, a whole lot of parties and unions. It's a pretty broad coalition, although the four headline organizations or parties are Socialist, Communist, Greens, and France Unbowed. And so they went into the election. They came in second, well ahead of Macron's centrist coalition. And now they've cut a deal with Macron, although some of his people aren't following it. What happens they have first the election, and then if nobody wins a majority in the first round, they go to a second round a week later, which happens tomorrow. And if you get 12.5% of the total vote, even if you come in third or even fourth, you can continue running. So the deal was, if you came in third in your constituency, France has single member districts like England, like here. If you came in third, you drop out. And so the Popular Front, this left coalition, candidates have dropped out if they came in third. Most of the Macron coalition candidates have, but some have not. In any case, they have a very good chance of preventing the far-right, neo-fascist National Rally, which came in first in that snap election. It got about 33%, the left coalition 28%, and Macron about 20%. And then the Republicans, who are centrist like Macron, got, I think, 14%. So the left has about a third of the vote, and hopefully they will get, something close to that and get representation in the French Parliament and be an influence there. So I think the lesson for us is, we shouldn't have people like Cornel West, joining the Greens and then going off on his own because he didn't want to deal with our, process for getting the nomination when he really didn't have much competition. And I think the abstention of many people on the independent socialist left from the Green Party. They say, well, it doesn't have socialist in its name, so maybe it's not for me. Or the Greens, we do have our problems, and they should come in and help us solve those problems. But we have a legacy of the socialist left in this country. Most of it works inside the Democratic Party. It goes back to the Popular Front, the communists set up in 1936 and pulled the labor movement and most of the left into the Democratic Party. And then the socialists, who were declining, followed suit in the 1950s. And so the old left got lost in the Democratic Party. And the new left lost the old socialist principle, going back to Marx, that the working class movement needs political independence from the capitalists in their parties. And so people treat working inside or outside the Democratic Party as a tactical decision that they can consider in each election. And what happens then is most of the result is people go defer to the Democratic Party because the only option on the ballot that's better than the Republicans that has a chance of winning. So the left disappeared as a distinct alternative with its own analysis and program and organization. And because of that, the Democrats have taken their left for granted and moved to the right. So what were the New Deal Democrats from the 1930s until the 1974 election really became the corporate New Democrats, as Bill Clinton called them, neoliberals. They went from what we called liberals, progressives, and the New Deal kind of programs to the neoliberals, privatization, austerity, reliance on market-based incentives for social policy instead of public agencies carrying out those policies and all that stuff. And that's because we haven't had an independent left. And this is a tangent from thoughts on the French election, but the fact that they have a left and we don't is why we don't have a left. The Greens, are the best we got, but much of what calls itself a left in this country, whether they're in the social movements, funded and organized and controlled by NGOs, or they're in socialist groups, they have stayed out of building a mass party on the left, which is what the Greens aspire to be. And until we can convince those social movement activists, those socialists, those other radicals to come into the Green Party, we're going to remain on the margins of where we should be. Our policies, like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal and the job guarantee, I mean, these have majoritarian, super majoritarian support. But the public opinion doesn't get translated into public policy because the Democrats take their left for granted, keep compromising with Republicans, and the whole political spectrum moves to the right. So one thing we should learn from the French elections is, I was talking about how we get divided and they've come together. And they came together before in the previous election. They called it the Social and Ecological Union, something like that. But then they divided after that election. Some of them were political issues, others were just personal issues. Who's going to be the top dog? That's something we got to fight against. But they came back together in this crisis so the far right doesn't take power. And so I guess the next question is, well, what does that mean for our elections? Should we unite behind the Democrats to stop our far right, represented by Trump? And my argument is the Democrats can't fight the far right. They've been compromising with it, trying to do bipartisanship with it, making it normal and legitimate. And they don't really respect our democratic rights anyway. We've got to build our own movement that is unequivocal, uncompromising in fighting for democracy and social and economic justice and environmental sanity. And, the two-party system doesn't offer that. And if we surrender our independent identity and our alternative to the Democrats, it disappears. And there are no solutions coming from the Democrats, even if they stop Trump. Of course, there are no solutions if Trump is in office. And then I guess the next question is, what do we do if Trump wins? And I think the thing we've got to do is speak up, keep our heads above the foxhole, and fight. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is people get scared and basically surrender to what Trump is going to do. We saw that after 9/11. We had a massive global justice movement dealing with, the injustices of the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund and these trade agreements like NAFTA. And after 9/11, it evaporated. And I was in that movement. People got scared. They didn't know what to do. Instead of, continuing to raise their demands, or like the Greens did to their credit, they said, we should not, do a regime change war in Afghanistan. We should treat this as a criminal prosecution issue and bring the criminals who did what they did to the trade towers and the other things they did to justice, by trying to capture them and bring them before a court of justice. Instead, we went off on these regime change wars throughout the Middle East and made the situation worse and really fueled the fire of Islamic fundamentalism and those factions of it that want to use terrorist tactics. So we got to speak up, and we can't let Trump intimidate us if he wins. And we need our own movement. The Democrats are not going to lead that fight. There'll be some whining, but it's going to be very muffled, and they're not going to mobilize people in the streets. That's our job. Leo, what immediate actions would you have taken this week to change the world in a good way after that Supreme Court's decision? Well, I would have, and did support, and I talked about it here. We need congressional legislation to deal with the Chevron doctrine decision. And I'm looking, and I haven't found anybody talk about what legislative remedies we have to the immunity decision. Can it be done by legislation, or will it require a constitutional amendment? But that's something that, we need to do. And then, we should be out in the streets, and nobody, with the capacity to mobilize large numbers did that. There was commentary in the media, but we're just not well organized enough, to have that kind of mass reaction. When we do have mass reactions like we did after Trump was elected, like we did after George Floyd was murdered, it's really spontaneous. And it's like people have grievances and something provokes them and they come out. And it's really something that's hard to call forth. But when it does, we should be there, be part of it, and give our opinions on where we should go. Like, reforming policing instead of relying on Democrats, which is where most of that movement went in the fall of 2020. We should have been talking about community control of the police in our own communities. That is an agency that is mostly locally controlled. It gets some state and federal funding, but it's governed locally. It's where we can set up, elected boards, or even boards elected like juries by sortition, to oversee police departments with the power to hire and fire officers, investigate abuses, and pass punishments for abuses, instead of leaving it to advisory civilian review boards and mayors and chiefs of police. So there was, a program that we could have put forward. And in a couple places we have. In Chicago, they got community control of the police. They've elected those review boards. It's a big city, so they have district review boards and a citywide board that's being implemented as we speak. And then in Minnesota, they had a petition for a referendum to do the same thing in Minneapolis. And the powers that be there had that petition rejected, on technical grounds. I don't know the details of that. What I am saying, though, is at least in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, they have pushed for community control and have enough support to get that petition in, and they vowed to keep going. So those are the kinds of things we need to do in response and when these movements erupt. And no doubt they will. They always do. There's more popular uprisings today than ever before. There's a book out called, what's it called? The subtitle is Mass Uprisings and the Missing Revolution. Vincent, I want to say Bevins wrote it. And he asks, why have all these eruptions from the United States to Hong Kong, the Arab uprising, the Maidan uprising in Ukraine, the pro-democracy demonstrations in Russia in 2011 and 2012, in Turkey, in Brazil, all over the world. We've had these uprisings, but they have been independent of institutions like trade unions and political parties that could sustain the movements, and we're in a position to take power and would hopefully have a program to resolve the issues that brought forth these movements, which is to say, we need to organize the Green Party as a party that can play a positive role when these protest movements erupt. So, immediate actions, I'm talking really, we've got to find legislation we can support to reverse these decisions. And then we've got to build the Green Party and our unions, if we're in them, to be in a position to influence these movements, which are going to arise because there's a lot of discontent. Wow, that last 18 minutes went quick. Sorry about the technical interruption. I don't know why we've had these short power outages for about a week now. And I'm not, it's sunny outside. It's very hot and humid, but I don't know why they're being caused. But in any case, next week, I may have a guest who is a candidate, or we may do question and answers again, but we will be here at the same time. And, everybody, let's get to work. It was a bad 10 days, but I think, we know what we need to do. We need to build a political alternative to the miserable choice that the leadership of the two major parties have offered us in their total failure to deal with the crises we face, from healthcare to housing to the climate. So, keep being active. And for those of you that are younger, I've been around where, we've made changes. We've won demands. And a lot of times you think you're just beating your head against the wall or a locked door, and suddenly you hit it and it pops open. And then everybody who was watching you says, "We are with you the whole time," and they go through the door with you. So you gotta know that even if you're not getting immediate feedback for what you're saying and doing, people are listening. And a lot of times it's kind of a conformist thing. People don't want to be the ones that stick out, that are the instigators, the advanced guard, but they may agree with you. And when it looks like a lot of people do, they'll be with you. So have faith that what you're doing makes a difference. And until next week, have a good week, everybody.